Welcome for this afternoon's episode of Innovations in Education for a Big, Bold Future. We're continuing to have discussions about how the American Rescue Plan dollars coming into Kentucky to support education recovery and a new foundation can be used at the local level. In the past, we've had conversations with partner organizations here in Kentucky, as well as most recently a recorded interview with Kentucky's Commissioner, Dr. Glass, about how the American Recovery Plan dollars could be used locally. And today we're pleased to have with us Terra Wallin, Associate Director of P12 for the Education Trust. And she's going to help us unpack from a federal level how these dollars can be used in the state and some best practices for using those dollars. A reminder for folks listening here in Kentucky, $2.1 billion is coming into the state of Kentucky directly to our school districts over the next 3 years to support recovery from COVID and also building that stronger, better foundation as we move forward. Those dollars, in addition to other local dollars in early childhood and post-secondary, and even to our cities and counties, can be used to ensure that we recover adequately from COVID and its impact on education. So Terra, thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C., from the Education Trust. So just if you would start off with just a little background on the American Rescue Plan, how it made its way through Congress, and some of the key earmarks, if you will, that are in the Rescue Plan for Education that we all need to be aware of.
Sure. Thanks, Bridget. Excited to be here and always eager to talk to folks with the Prichard Committee and others in the state of Kentucky. So the American Rescue Plan was signed into law in early March by President Biden. It was really the third kind of stimulus or recovery package that included funding for K-12 education. So some people may recall all the way back to March and April of last year, there was something called the CARES Act, which provided funding to K-12 schools. Then there was another kind of set of stimulus or relief funding passed in late December, called the CRRSA or CRSA or whatever you want to call it, which also had similarly some money set aside for K-12.
Here in the States, we've kind of thrown around ESSER, the ESSER dollars, ESSER 1, ESSER 2.
Yep, so that was that elementary and secondary education recovery chunk out of those two things. And there were some other things in there that are related to education, but really the kind of significant set of resources, by far the largest package and the most comprehensive in some ways, was the American Rescue Plan Act, which was signed into law in March. So just for a little bit of federal perspective, across those three big bills, that's about $200 billion nationally that's being invested in K-12 education. And some people remember back to 2008 and coming out of the Great Recession into 2009, there was something called ARA, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, which ended up funding programs like Race to the Top and a lot of other initiatives people may remember. But I think important to know at that time, it was about $100 billion for K-12. We're now having, this is about $200 billion, and it's coming much faster than that money came. And so I think that's just important in context of how significant this investment is. And the other big difference is that a lot of that funding was controlled at the federal or the state level. So the federal government made choices to invest in things like Race to the Top, and states did lots of various things with it, from everything from investing in data systems to doing school improvement work. But this time, most of the money is going down to the district level.
Okay, so a very different dynamic.
Very different.
Really leaning into local control and the unique responses that will be needed locally to truly recover from the impact of COVID.
Absolutely. And I think it's both an understanding of making sure that the money is getting to the ground as quickly as possible. And also knowing that COVID has impacted communities differently. Mm-hmm. We know that everyone has been affected in some way, and every student, but we know that that impact has been much more severe in communities that were already underinvested in or under-resourced, and communities of color, communities with low-income families. And so the funding is targeted more to those communities. but every state is receiving some version of the ESSER $3 or the ARP ESSER funds.
Okay. And Tara, it's important, I think, to note for our listeners as well, as we understand the kind of the long arc here, that the ESSER 1 and to a larger extent, the ESSER $2 were really for that rapid response kind of health and safety. As states were grappling with, should students be at home? Should teachers be at home? Should they be in the classroom? And now we're actually able to move to that next phase where we're thinking about really what education recovery needs to look like. And not only recovery, but how do we leverage what we learned through this time to have a stronger system on the other side?
Absolutely. And I think there's some provisions in the American Rescue Plan that certainly recognize that. So one of the differences from the other ESSER funds that have happened in the past is that this requires that, so of the big pot of money, so about the $2 billion you mentioned Kentucky is getting, the state controls about 10% of that funding. So the Kentucky Department of Education will be thinking about how to use that for statewide initiatives or kind of coordinated statewide approaches to address the interrupted learning that's happening. But about 90% of the money is going to go down to individual districts. And that amount of money your district receives is going to be based on its share of Title I. And Title I is based on students from low-income backgrounds and low-income families, those communities. And so that's how the funding is targeted. But what the
schools with large populations of students living in low-income households will receive a larger portion of those dollars from a statewide perspective. So they're not equally dispersed.
Absolutely, right. They're targeted at those communities. And I think that's recognizing kind of the impact both of COVID in terms of health and safety. We know that those communities were hit harder by the virus and the healthcare implications. We also know that those communities were hit harder by the economic downturn that we've seen over the last year, and job loss, economic mobility, those things, right? And Title I, frankly, is the best existing option we have. And a big goal of this funding was to get it out quickly, right? So they decided to go through an existing formula and not create something totally new. But the key difference in this funding than others, to get to your point of kind of really looking forward, is that the ARP, unlike the other things, requires that districts use at least 20% of their funding to address unfinished learning. Some people will call it learning loss. We really want to think of it as unfinished learning. It's something we do have the opportunity to finish moving forward. And I should say that's a minimum. It's at least 20% of the funding. I think we would expect that districts are spending the vast majority of their funding on addressing unfinished learning and the social, emotional, academic development needs of their students. And that we can get a little bit into of what those strategies might look like. But that's really a key difference, is this is really thinking deeply about academic recovery moving forward, but can certainly be used to address a lot of the inequities we know, frankly, existed before COVID, and COVID just shined a light on them.
So that's an important note, that 20%, at least 20% on recovery, on unfinished learning, and finishing it up, or helping move our kids forward. So above and beyond that 20%, are there any restrictions on the rest of the dollars?
I think the short answer, frankly, is no. These funds can be used lots of different ways. They can be used for everything from addressing immediate safety needs, right? So in places where you may still need PPE, you may need to think about sanitation. You may want to think about ventilation, right? Even facilities repairs that you need, to these academic supports, to hiring more school counselors or more educators to support this acceleration. Really, any of the things that are allowed under the big existing federal education laws are all allowed here.
Okay. And Tara, I want to stop you there, because I think it's important to note that where there are needs in districts to put ventilation in their buildings, or to create building structures that are more resilient to any type of future health pandemic, that the dollars can be used for that. So sometimes I think when we hear folks say, well, maybe we're going to put something into buildings, we're not always thinking there could be health and safety measures there that are important. But that is allowable, and some districts will need to do something like that.
Yeah, that's right. And actually the US Department of Education put out a frequently asked questions document, which is fairly complicated, but I'm positive the folks at KDE are digging into it, where it outlines some of these specific questions. May ESSER funds be used for this purpose or that purpose? And while it's complicated, it's a good go-to resource for state and local leaders to, if they want to double check and make sure that something they want to use funding on is acceptable. But I think what you'll see in there is that most uses of funds are acceptable for this pot of money.
So how about earmarks for out of school time programming, summer learning, through many of our maybe 21st century learning program providers or other local providers?
Yeah, so
there are earmarks. Go ahead. Are there earmarks?
There are a little bit. So at the state level, so states get to hang on to 10% of the funding, as I mentioned. They have to use 5% of those funds, so really half of what they get, right? 5% compared to the 10% for addressing unfinished learning at the state level. They have to use 1% for comprehensive after school programming, and they have to use 1% for summer enrichment. So the state funding, I will say, is quite specific in that it's really focused on addressing these student needs and accelerating learning, starting in the summer, continuing into the school year, and taking place in comprehensive after school. And then there's a little bit of that, about 3% left for states to think about what other needs they may have. The 20% set aside for addressing unfinished learning could also be used to support extended school day or extended school year, which could mean kind of what would be traditionally after school or summer programming. But it could certainly be used to think about which services are offered, what makes sense in the community. I think from our perspective, we know this might look different in a lot of places. You'll have communities with, for example, high school students who perhaps work in the summer to help support their families financially, or they work after school. Maybe in those places, it makes most sense to offer targeted intensive tutoring during the school day or during a specific part of the summer after school. Maybe it's elementary school, and actually extended school day is the best option to align with community and family schedules. Mm-hmm. And there's that flexibility to really do what works best for community. We just want to make sure that all those opportunities are high quality. They're aligned with the content kids are doing during the school day, right? We want students to have enriching opportunities, but we do want to make sure that they're connected in some way to their normal school day as well.
Absolutely. So Terra, before we leave the 10% set aside at the state level, I want to ask you a question about broadband access, because we know that was a big problem for many areas of the country and many areas of Kentucky. As we went into the pandemic, the broadband infrastructure simply was not there, particularly the quote unquote last mile, which actually takes broadband from the super highway out the road to someone's house, where learning, working, and access to healthcare was happening through COVID. Kentucky ranks 42nd in the nation for access to broadband. So are any of those dollars, particularly at the state level, do you see states using those for broadband initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point. And I think, there's some research from some of our partners has come out in the last few months to show, nationally, we have something like an estimated 16 million children who are still not online or don't have access to devices. I think a lot of people may make the assumption, because many students have been learning from home over the last year, that means they all have the ability to do that and that they have the internet devices. And we just know that's not true. So the American Rescue Plan actually includes about $7 billion that's specifically about broadband and specifically thinking about students, schools, libraries, how to give them access. The FCC has actually started releasing some of the places online where people can go sign up. So low-income families, low-income college students can actually get high-speed internet subsidized. Some of that funding can be used for the infrastructure you're talking about to make sure even if they can get it paid for through those programs, that the structure is actually there for them to tap into. And then states could use, states and districts, frankly, could use their money to think about both infrastructure, devices, connectivity. I think we are still seeing now states have to put together a plan for how they're going to use their funding and submit it to the US Department of Education by June 7th. I think that Kentucky released its draft plan today on May 27th. I haven't seen it. I haven't had a chance to review it yet, but it's out there. So I think it would be great to dive into that and see if they talk about broadband. But we have heard a number of states still talking about how to address this issue.
Okay, great. And what I hear you saying is the dollars coming into the state for education, whether at the state level or the local level, are not the only dollars available for broadband.
Absolutely. There's this set aside of this funding for broadband. I will say there are also a difference in the American Rescue Plan from the prior package was that the American Rescue Plan includes money for state and local governments. And that money can be used for lots of different things, from healthcare, transportation, economic support, can also be used for education related things. So I also think it would be great for community members and stakeholders be asking your city council, your mayor, whoever it is that's controlling your town's budget, how are they going to use that money, and how is it going to be connected to how education is using the money?
Yeah, excellent, excellent. And so, that's a piece we've talked quite a bit about, is needing community collaboration at the local level to really ensure that all the dollars that are coming into the state from various streams at the federal level are leveraged for full recovery, education recovery being a core component of that local recovery.
Absolutely. And I think this is one we're really thinking about coherence across the state, right? When there are particular resources for broadband, would love to see people tapping into those resources first because they're so targeted. And then thinking about how your broader funding streams, like that state and local funding or the education, the ESSER funding, can then help fill in some of the gaps maybe, but really need to be thinking across those pots of money.
Yeah, great. So Terra, let's move then to the strategies that the Education Trust has identified as key strategies that local leaders should consider utilizing, employing for recovery to support advancement of unfinished learning. Yeah. So what are some of the key strategies that the Education Trust has identified that local leaders may opt to use?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start even maybe one level above that, what are the kind of key questions to be asking district leaders? And I think these are questions that families or parents could ask, their advocates could be asking them to help guide us in the right direction. And then that gets a little bit of the strategy. But I think, to your point, it's so crucial that we have community input, that the people who are directly impacted by these programs have a say in both what they need and how it's going. And so I think the first question for districts and communities is really, how are you going to engage a diverse set of stakeholders? How are you going to be gathering input from students and families and educators, advocates, other community leaders about what goes into your plan for how you're going to use these resources? The funding is good through kind of late 2024. So this is really over the next 3 years. So I think it's both, how are you getting input now, and how are you going to keep that feedback loop going through implementation to see that what you start doing, do you keep doing that? Do you make changes as student needs change, right? We're going to have some students coming back into physical school buildings who haven't been in school, some students who have been in physical school buildings, but maybe not full time, who may be in the fall, and there's going to be some figuring out what their needs are.
And that's, I think, an important point that really differentiates, again, this funding, while it outsizes any funding through the Great Recession and certainly the ESSER 1 and 2 pots of money. But the other piece that really differentiates this money coming into local districts is the 3-year arc of time that the money can be used. So there's a real opportunity here for kind of sustainability of approaches and a sustained move out of COVID. And to your point about making sure communities are at the table, not just in the initial planning, but throughout a 3-year process, is a great opportunity to instill that local collaboration that will benefit us over the long run.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, this is both, 3 years is a long time in some ways to really think about sustained recovery. And I think this comes from a recognition of it's not going to be that students come back to school in August maybe, and by October they're caught up. And that's through no fault of the students or educators, but this takes
Right.
time.
That's right.
And so we
Right.
need to be planning that runway to get there, and then thinking of it really is a launching off point then beyond that, to continue, progressing and seeing gains and closing opportunity gaps we know exist.
Yeah, it's important that we're all part of the solution. The impact of COVID on education, and I want to underscore that point that you made, is certainly no one's fault. It's a global health pandemic that we're all trying to recover from, and we need to do that together.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so I think it starts with asking leaders how they're going to engage these communities. I think another really critical question is to use what data are they going to use to inform the strategies that they choose or the plans that they make. Sometimes when people hear data, I think they just think assessment data or test data. And while we think data on academics is really important to know where our students are and where they may need additional support coming up, it's also looking at data about social emotional needs. And maybe that's through surveys of students or their families, maybe mental health needs or physical health needs that either the school district has information on, maybe the county health department has information on. To your question about broadband, right? Do you have a good sense of what students in your district or your school still need help getting access to online learning, right? Like that's good data to be collecting if you don't already have it. And maybe you have various chunks of data and it's about bringing it together.
Yeah, that's great, Tara. So the first step is asking the right questions, and the community can be part of asking those questions. And then identifying responses to those questions by first looking at the data. What do we know about that question? I think it's terrific that you outlined that the data is not just test data, but it is data, survey data even, around how students were impacted by the pandemic. We at the Prichard Committee went through a series of surveys last year, surveying students, families, teachers, post-secondary students, and even early childhood families and providers to better understand the impact. And without a doubt, mental health came through across the board as an impact that we all need to pay attention to. So let's step into then. So we've asked the right questions. We've brought data to the table to really understand the need. And now we want to think about solutions. So I want you to share with us some of those solutions, even if it's in the social emotional space or the academic space. What might some of those solutions look like? And as we move into that space, Tara, one question I want to ask first is, we know one of the questions through the pandemic has been, what kids are we not connecting with? Are there kids and families we've lost who have become invisible through this process? What has the Ed Trust said about that, or what are your thoughts about how we first make sure we're connecting with all kids again?
Yeah, I think that's really important, right? And you can design all kinds of strategies for once kids are in school buildings or after school programs, but if they don't get there, then you've missed a real opportunity. And I think that gets at something here that's connecting to the data and your strategies, which are the strategies and the things, frankly, you're paying for with the ARP don't have to be just COVID things, right? They can be thinking about gaps that maybe existed before COVID that COVID only exacerbated. And so I'll give an example. Maybe prior to COVID, you had big gaps in your school or district in terms of students that were enrolled in advanced coursework. What we've seen nationally from most of the data is that traditionally Black students and Latino students are under enrolled in advanced placement courses or 8th grade algebra or gifted and talented down at the elementary school level. We know that given COVID, those patterns likely are still holding true, or they may be even worse because students didn't have opportunities to enroll in all the courses we'd like them to. So how are you thinking about if that's a significant challenge in your community and it's something your community wants to address, you could use this funding to get more students into those advanced coursework opportunities, to help pay for things like dual enrollment courses or really rigorous high quality workforce and career technical education programs. So I think it's important to think kind of about data about what existed prior to this. And frankly, there were some students who were disengaged before And COVID exacerbated that problem. And so how do you think about your plan addressing the immediate COVID things, right? And it's easy to point to things like mask or vaccination or air safety. But you also have to think about the whole needs of the child and what existed before COVID. And so I think in terms of strategies, we put out a series of research briefs, focus on three big things in terms of addressing unfinished learning. One of those was around targeted intensive tutoring. There's a lot of good research that tutoring can work, but it has to be done with high quality. And what that really means is you need kind of certified teachers, ideally, although you could have really well-trained paraprofessionals or other school staff. But those tutors need to be supported, right? They need to be prepared about what their content they're doing. They need to be supported throughout about how to differentiate for different students. They need to be in small groups, so 4 kids or less. They need to be really consistent, happening basically every day throughout the school year, ideally kind of built into the school day structure. And so that's a really promising strategy, but it has to be done well. And I think the other thing we've talked about a lot is expanded learning time, which similarly, a lot of people are thinking about making up lost time. This can take on a lot of different variations. It can be after school, can be summer. I think the important thing here is that it's thoughtful, it's aligned with the curriculum, it's meeting students where they're at and helping them accelerate. It's not about remediation. It's not about just redoing old things. It's actually about moving kids forward, but helping them fill in the gaps where maybe they missed a particular skill or a particular point of knowledge. And the third thing we highlight is exactly what you said, is the importance of strong relationships. Tutoring, expanded learning time, after school. If there aren't strong relationships between students and educators, those strategies, I don't think we're going to see the return on investment we want, or we're not going to see the outcomes we're hoping for. And so this is really about it when we're thinking of funding. How can you build in time in your school day that's purposeful time set aside to help build relationships? And so we see people do that in different ways, kind of advisory periods or homerooms, but that have some kind of set structure, small groups. And maybe they're focused on students' outside interests, their hobbies, their activities.
Passion projects.
Absolutely. And they give educators and students a real opportunity to connect and build relationships that also then have implications for their academic work and their ability to have meaningful academic conversation.
So Terra, one of the things I hear coming through loud and clear as you kind of listed those 3 primary strategies, intensive tutoring, expanded learning time, and relationships. Underscoring all of that, I hear loud and clear, ensuring that all along the way we're instilling a love of learning, a love of teaching and learning for our teachers and our students. That this is not a time to double down on drills or anything like that. This is a time to really embrace a rich and expansive learning environment. That supports our young people's curiosity on their own path of learning and helps ensure that they meet the standards necessary for their progress along the years in education and prepares them for success in later years. So I think that's so important to continue to underscore.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's a little bit of this tension, I think, in some places that it's either academics or it's not academics. And I think the important thing to think about is these things can be connected. Right. So when we think about enrichment activities over the summer, right, we want to get kids instill, this return to school, this love of learning. We want to re-engage the kids you talked about who maybe weren't logged on, or the kids who logged on but not frequently. Yeah. What can we tap into that will get them interested, but also help them start, thinking about literacy and math and science? And so when we're thinking about summer, maybe there's a component of targeted intensive tutoring, or there's some kind of classroom-based help, and it's combined with field trip opportunities to actually see how some of that learning applies in the real world. And field trips are a great opportunity for adults and students to bond, and adults to bond with each other, and students to bond with each other, right? So how do we think about children as whole people that need both of those things? And it doesn't have to be one or the other. You know, we don't want kids just sitting in a classroom in kind of a drill and kill mentality.
Right. Yeah. So environments, right? Conducive environments and relationships, conducive for growth.
Absolutely. And I think this goes to the thinking about pre-COVID. You know, one of the things we've been thinking about is there are going to be kids coming back to school buildings who maybe haven't been in a building, or they've been on their computer, or they've been in and out of one of those things. It's going to be a change for them to be back in a school full time. And so there may be behaviors where they're struggling. And how do we think about those as setting the environment for them? Excuse me. Instead of, you know, pushing them out of the classroom through exclusionary discipline, how do we create a welcoming environment so that we can help them get back on track?
Yeah, excellent. So Terra, last question, engagement. So, you know, I'm a community stakeholder, I'm a business leader, I'm a parent in a local community. I really want to be part of the solution. How do I do that? How do I go about making sure I can be part of the solution?
I think there's the timeline question just for everyone to know about. So right now, states are kind of finalizing their plan for what they're going to do on a state level. And then every district that's getting these funds has to have a plan for how they're going to use it. And they're required by federal law and the federal application process to meaningfully engage community stakeholders. And so if you aren't hearing from your district about an opportunity to provide input, there's nothing on the website, or you haven't gotten a letter home, they're doing it. So reach out to them and say, hey, I know our district is getting funding. What's the plan to use that? Where can I provide feedback? Where can I see our plan, right? That's kind of one avenue to start. And then, like you said, we want these to be ongoing conversations. And so I think community members saying, I know there's a plan, I want to be involved, and how can I stay involved, right? What is going to be the structure? Is it through board meetings? Is it through committee? Like, you know, there's lots of different ways this can look, but what are we going to keep doing so I can keep weighing it?
Yeah. So we've called for guiding coalitions at the local level. And as you're describing some of that work, you know, I think we'd love to see some of these guiding coalitions take root at the local level and even formalize themselves possibly with an aspirational name for what they're trying to accomplish as a school community on behalf of education and our learners. There's a real opportunity here. And I think that opportunity, that hope is beginning to take hold. And certainly these dollars from Congress will help make this work possible and help alleviate some of the fatigue that I know we're all just beginning to come out of.
Absolutely. And you could use the funding to think about how to set some of these things up too, right? Like maybe you need some district time and staff to pay for somebody to engage in this engagement work. You could use the ARP funding for that. Yeah,
excellent point. Terra, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the American Rescue Plan dollars and how they can be utilized at the local level. This will be kind of a fast turnaround initially, but a long arc. And so we thank you for the work of the Education Trust in getting some of the strategies out there that local districts can use and for helping us all unpack not only the information, but the power and the opportunity in front of us. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Happy to join you.